So here's a question to kick things off. What happens when a global superpower uh, quietly steps back from a whole continent, expects a void, maybe chaos, but finds something else entirely, a reconfigured map?
That's exactly the puzzle we're digging into today. It really makes you rethink assumptions about global influence, doesn't it?
It does. So we're unpacking this recent, surprisingly quiet withdrawal of the U.S. from Africa, specifically under the Trump administration.
Right. We'll look at, the stated reasons versus what actually happened on the ground. And maybe most importantly, Africa's own strategic response, which often gets overlooked.
And we're drawing on insights from a pretty unique source and analysis. It gives a perspective you might not find in, let's say, mainstream reports.
Definitely. Our mission really is to see how this disengagement, which was framed as saving money, shifting burdens, might have maybe unintentionally pushed Africa towards new partners.
And maybe even towards a stronger Africa First approach, more self-reliance.
Exactly. A shift that could, seriously, start to redefine global power dynamics. It's a big story unfolding.
Okay, so let's start with the exit itself. The source calls it a silent withdrawal. Not loud, not dramatic. What did that actually look like, this quiet, calculated, slow disassembly?
Well, it means it wasn't a big announcement, we're leaving. It was more subtle. An executive order, cutting financial aid here, quietly pulling back on loan guarantees there, reducing troop presence.
Boots on the ground, yeah?
Right. And it was all presented, wrapped in this language of efficiency and burden sharing. So it kind of flew under the radar for a lot of people. It was gradual, almost stealthy.
Which leads to this idea the source brings up, a miscalculation of leverage. The goal was supposedly save money, shift risk, let African nations carry their own burden. Sounds logical, maybe.
On the surface, sure.
But why does the analysis argue it wasn't about control, but actually a loss of leverage for the U.S.?
That's the crux of it. The assumption seemed to be, if we pull back a bit, they'll need us more, value us more. But the source suggests the opposite happened. By trying to shrink its role, the U.S., well, it accidentally shrank its own influence, its relevance, a misread of the room, essentially.
And the timing. While the U.S. was focused inward, protecting the homeland, what were other players doing in Africa? Because they weren't exactly sitting idle, were they?
Not at all. That's where the picture gets really clear. While the U.S. was stepping back, you had China building infrastructure, ports, you name it. Russia was maneuvering, often using groups like Wagner.
Right, the paramilitary group.
Exactly. Turkey was investing, the Gulf states were entrenching themselves. So America's absence, it became more and more obvious. And crucially, the source says it wasn't seen as a threat to Africa, but more like a sign of U.S. decline.
Okay, let's pivot to Africa's reaction, because this is where it gets really interesting, maybe counterintuitive for some listeners. The U.S. scales back military, shuts down drone bases. You'd expect, what, please, for them to stay? Panic.
That was the expectation, yes. Shockwaves, panic. But the source highlights something quite different, the reality. The continent barely flinched.
Barely flinch, wow.
Yeah, and that silence, the analysis is quite pointed here. It wasn't gratitude for past help, it was indifference. Africa just adjusted, which really challenges who we think holds the cards in these relationships.
So no chasing after the U.S., no please come back.
Nope. The source is clear. Africa didn't chase the U.S., it simply turned to the next available option. Meaning forming new security alliances, relying more on their own regional forces, or yes, dealing more directly with China, Russia, Turkey. It was immediate, practical agency in action, not desperation.
Let's take Niger as a specific case. The U.S. had that big drone base in Agadez. Very advanced, a key part of their counterterrorism strategy there.
A huge investment, yeah.
So when the U.S. packed up, what happened? Did Niger's government beg them to reconsider?
Far from it. According to the source, they started looking east almost right away. They opened the door to Russian advisors, started exploring military tech deals with Turkey.
Really? Okay.
And more than that, they started asking, some hard questions like, American drones were here for years, so why did the insurgency keep spreading? The analysis frames this as an absence of results leading to no loyalty to the brand. It wasn't about the flag. It was about whether the security approach was actually working.
That really forces you to rethink the actual impact of that U.S. military presence. I mean, 6,000 personnel across 50-plus countries sounds like a lot. Trainers, intel liaisons.
Feels great on a PowerPoint slide, right? But the source argues that on the battlefield, it meant little. That African militaries felt deep down they'd always been alone.
That's a stark assessment.
It is. And the source goes further, suggesting African militaries are, quote, failing at the same rate they were when Trump U.S. was still there. Now, this isn't presented as a defense of those struggles, but rather as an indictment of Washington's overinflated self-importance. The implication is the U.S. presence wasn't the game changer it was perhaps thought to be.
So with the U.S. pulling back, whatever strategic discipline, quote unquote, they might have imposed well, it's evaporating. And we know security vacuums don't stay empty. What's rushing in?
Exactly. They don't stay empty. What you're seeing now is local forces improvising, adapting. Some are, yes, cooperating with groups like Wagner. Others are forming new, sometimes unexpected, local alliances. It's much more fluid, much less predictable, and certainly less controlled by any single outside power.
Bringing this back to the bigger picture, it feels like the U.S. walked away from the table, maybe expecting the game to just stop. But the source paints this picture of Africa not just being the prize anymore, but learning how to deal the cards. What does it really mean, Africa as the card dealer?
It's a fundamental shift in perspective, isn't it? The game didn't end. The table just got bigger. New players, new currencies, both literal and figurative, new rules. Africa, which for so long was maybe seen as a continent to be acted upon, is now actively dealing, shaping the game.
So less reactive, more proactive, setting terms.
Precisely. They're negotiating, playing different powers off one another. The source mentions signing deals with one hand while rewriting contracts with the other.
That sounds strategically sophisticated.
And the analysis labels it exactly that, strategy, not chaos. It argues this whole situation has actually sped up Africa's political learning curve. It's about maximizing national interests by engaging with everyone, not just tying yourself to one partner.
Burkina Faso comes up as a key example here. Under Ibrahim Traoré, France and the U.S. lost influence. What happened next? How did Traoré's leadership embody this new approach?
Burkina Faso is fascinating. After the Western powers lost leverage, the government didn't collapse. It consolidated. Traoré's military leadership didn't just kick out foreign forces, which they did, but they then replaced that presence with bilateral deals on their terms.
So, selective engagement.
Exactly. Russian advisors were welcomed, but the source says not worshipped. It implies a pragmatic, maybe even transactional relationship, not about ideology. They prioritized local industries and, crucially, African alliances like the AES or the Alliance of Sahel States emerged. These are framed as declarations of autonomy, not just new proxies.
And this isn't just happening in the Sahel, right? This non-alignment as leverage seems broader.
Oh, definitely. The source gives other examples. Think Ethiopia flirts with Chinese financing while refusing to give up sovereignty. They take the money but resist the kind of strings Western lenders might attach. Or Senegal. You've got Western-backed democratic institutions right alongside Gulf-funded economic zones. And South Africa's role in BRICS that gives them huge bargaining power. It's not about ideological loyalty to Russia or China. It's about having more options. The source sums it up perfectly. Africa's new diplomacy, non-alignment as leverage. They're carving out their own space.
But what about the U.S.'s standing in all this? Its credibility. The source describes the U.S. image as, well, unpredictable. Loud one day, absent the next. Focus on short-term optics over long-term partnerships.
Yeah, and that image, the analysis suggests, is hard to shake, especially when other players, whatever their own motives, might offer more consistency. In this emerging landscape, credibility is currency.
So it's not just about economic or military power anymore.
Less so, perhaps. It's about who shows up without condescension, who actually listens, adapts, and crucially, who doesn't assume ownership of Africa's future. That seems to be the new benchmark for partnership.
A lesson maybe China learned over time, Russia's learning now, Turkey and India are trying out. Seems like it. It's about presenting yourself as a viable option, not necessarily the only savior. And here's a key twist. Even as these new players engage, the source argues Africa is simultaneously becoming less dependent on all of them.
How so?
Through internal strengthening. Think booming digital innovation across the continent, growing intercontinental trade, trying to build their own markets, exploring new currency ideas, creating Pan-African security pacts. These are frameworks being piloted, adjusted, and implemented. It shows a continent increasingly looking inward and towards its neighbors for solutions.
That sounds like the Africa First architecture really taking shape. You mentioned the AES, bloc coordinating military strategy. What else?
East Africa, building infrastructure without a single Western blueprint. Southern Africa launching rare earth deals, bypassing Western extraction models, taking control of their own resources, even dialogue with Europe about Mediterranean issues happening more directly, more with
Yeah.
Europe than with Washington.
It's diversification across the board. Absolutely. And the source delivers a pretty blunt conclusion. The U.S., through its withdrawal and maybe its perceived indifference, made Africa hyper-aware of how disposable it was in American eyes. And now, Africa is, quote, simply returning the favor.
So wrapping this up, what's the final takeaway? The source seems pretty clear. Africa has moved on. It describes the continent as younger, sharper, more unified, more aware of its worth, and far less patient, with partners who seem unreliable.
And the implication for the U.S.: if it wants to re-engage meaningfully, the price of admission will be steep, the conditions will be strict, and that invitation, it won't be automatic. The analysis basically says the table the U.S. walked away from, Africa has already built a new one, and maybe this time a seat with an American flag isn't guaranteed or even necessary from their perspective.
Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder. What does this whole situation, America's quiet retreat, Africa's dynamic, self-directed response, really signal about the future? About how global power works, how influence is defined, in a world that's clearly becoming more multipolar?